The Allied troops had successfully held their lines all day, repelling thousands of rounds of incoming fire. But their defensive positions collapsed every night, not due to bullets, but due to a complete erosion of sanity.
This is the brutal truth of the Imperial Japanese Army's mastery of darkness, a doctrine so profoundly effective that it weaponized the mere absence of light, turning a natural phenomenon into a devastating strategic advantage.
For most armies operating in the early years of World War II, darkness signaled a pause, a moment to reorganize, resupply, and rest. For the Imperial Japanese Army, IJA, it was the initiation signal.
Night was not a limitation. It was the ideal moment to strike, a canvas upon which the IJA painted a psychological warfare masterpiece. Long before facing the combined forces of the Allies in the Pacific and Southeast Asia, Japanese soldiers were subjected to relentless training, learning to march, maneuver, communicate, and fight almost entirely without artificial illumination.
This was not field improvisation. It was institutional thinking, codified in operational manuals that prioritized surprise and demoralization over massed firepower.
The primary target of the Japanese night assault was never the physical defensive line. It was the far more fragile structure of command, coordination, and, most importantly, enemy morale. Instead of heavy frontal assaults designed to smash through prepared positions, Japanese units moved in dispersed, often silent formations. Their objective was to close the distance rapidly, engaging the enemy at extremely short ranges. The tools of choice were simple, intimate, and brutal. The bayonet, the hand grenade, and small unit coordination. The volume of fire was secondary to the element of shock. In countless engagements, Allied defenders were assaulted before they even recognized the attack had begun, often hearing movement inside their perimeter before the first shot was fired. The psychological effect was immediate and devastating. Allied units, whose training was overwhelmingly focused on daytime, coordinated combat, suddenly found all their advantages neutralized. Artillery support, the foundation of Western defense, became nearly impossible to coordinate when forward observation vanished. Defensive fire plans, meticulously laid out during daylight reconnaissance, collapsed when visibility dropped to zero. Officers struggled to differentiate friend from foe, while Japanese troops, highly trained to recognize subtle movements, sounds, and silhouettes, retained their cohesion. Reports flowing back from early campaigns in Malaya and Guadalcanal reveal a striking, repeated pattern. Positions that had held firmly throughout the day often became unstable after sunset. This instability was rarely the result of being physically overrun, but rather because the internal structure of the defending unit simply unraveled. Companies lost contact with headquarters. Counterattacks stalled due to communication failures. Entire battalions withdrew, not because they were decisively defeated by superior numbers, but because they were isolated, confused, and convinced they were surrounded. The effectiveness of these night attacks was not measured solely in enemy casualties. It was measured in exhaustion. Japanese forces frequently followed up initial assaults with relentless, probing harassment throughout the entire night, denying defenders any possibility of rest. By dawn, soldiers who still possessed ammunition and intact physical defenses were often mentally and physically spent. Allied troops later admitted that the fear of nightfall itself became a palpable tactical disadvantage.
Darkness no longer promised safety. It promised uncertainty. And that uncertainty eroded combat effectiveness faster and more completely than any aerial bombardment.
The Japanese army didn't just fight at night. It reshaped how night felt to the enemy. This doctrine of psychological disintegration relied heavily on infiltration tactics, the art of dissolving into the enemy's lines without breaking them. Japanese assaults rarely began where the enemy expected concentration. Rather than battering the strongest point of a defensive line, small, highly autonomous groups slipped forward through gaps, terrain folds, dense vegetation, and blind spots, areas that standard Western doctrine often dismissed as impassable or irrelevant. The immediate objective was never destruction, it was disorientation.
These infiltration teams operated independently, moving forward without relying on continuous contact with higher command.
Once the attack commenced, their targets were chosen with surgical precision: field artillery positions, communication lines, crucial supply dumps, and most critically, command posts.
If these elements were neutralized, the front line could remain physically intact, holding its ground, yet instantly become combat ineffective, a beautifully engineered military paralysis.
This approach savagely exploited a critical weakness in the coordinated, layered defensive systems favored by the Allies.
Western-style defenses relied absolutely on real-time communication. Artillery needed forward observers, reserves required clear orders, and counterattacks demanded reliable messaging. Infiltration severed that coordination chain.
Battlefield reports repeatedly describe the same terrifying sequence: heavy, sporadic firing erupting deep behind the lines, urgent messages going unanswered, artillery crews attacked from unexpected rear angles, command posts relocating frantically or falling silent entirely. Units still positioned at the front, facing forward, suddenly possessed no guidance on whether to hold, withdraw, or counterattack. They were tactically blind.
In Malaya and the Philippines, there are well-documented instances where Allied units abandoned perfectly prepared positions without ever having been directly overrun. They were not defeated by overwhelming firepower. They were defeated by isolation. Japanese doctrine accepted the extreme risks inherent in this method. Infiltration teams were often lightly armed and highly vulnerable if discovered, but their success was predicated on timing, not survival. Even a brief, targeted disruption at the critical moment could cause the entire defensive response to collapse. What made the tactic so lethal was its quiet efficiency. There was no dramatic breakthrough, no single obvious moment of defeat. By the time enemy commanders realized their rear areas were compromised, the battle had already been fundamentally shifted against them.
Japanese infiltration tactics demonstrated a brutal, fundamental truth of modern warfare. A defense can look solid on a map and yet already be dead in reality.
The key to enabling this rapid, unpredictable infiltration was the mastery of jungle warfare, turning what the Allies viewed as an impenetrable barrier into a pathway. To many Allied planners, the dense vegetation, debilitating heat, crippling humidity, and endemic disease of Southeast Asia were natural defenders, expected to slow any attacker to a crawl.
Maps marked vast areas as natural barriers, roads were fortified, and open ground was protected. The terrain beyond the tree line was often treated as an empty, safe vacuum. The Japanese army saw something else entirely: concealment.
Japanese doctrine strictly forbade treating jungle terrain as an obstacle to maneuver. Instead, it was treated as the ultimate cloak. Soldiers were trained to move through the thickest vegetation in dispersed columns, maintaining direction by compass and highly developed terrain sense, rather than relying on visible roads. Supply loads were ruthlessly reduced.
Units were conditioned to accept hunger, fatigue, and intense discomfort as the mandatory price of achieving operational surprise. This singular mindset allowed Japanese forces to appear in places defenders swore no enemy could reasonably reach.
Jungle-covered hills, mosquito-infested swamps, and deep ravines became approach routes, not boundaries. Defensive positions, built and oriented to face roads and beaches, suddenly found themselves attacked simultaneously from the rear or the exposed flanks. In Malaya and Burma, Allied commanders repeatedly reported engagements where Japanese troops emerged from directions explicitly labeled impassable on their maps. Entire defensive plans collapsed, not due to structural weakness, but due to incorrect orientation.
The jungle drastically altered the scale of combat itself. Visibility dropped to mere meters. Artillery observation became unreliable and often useless. Air support struggled desperately to identify targets beneath the canopy.
Under these conditions, the Japanese emphasis on small unit initiative and extremely close-range coordination proved decisive.
Battles ceased to be about massed firepower. They became about which side could move, detect, and react faster at close quarters. While this commitment came at a severe cost, disease and exhaustion often affected Japanese units as badly as enemy fire. Japanese command considered these losses operationally acceptable. The decisive factor was tempo. Every unexpected appearance behind a defensive line forced the enemy to immediately redeploy, withdraw, or risk disastrous encirclement. The jungle didn't just hide Japanese movements, it utterly distorted Allied perception. When defenders could no longer reliably predict where an attack would originate, every direction became dangerously exposed. What the Allies had categorized as a natural barrier, the IJA skillfully turned into a powerful, silent weapon.
This rapid tempo was further enabled by one of the most unexpected and strategically brilliant tools of the campaign, the bicycle.
The Japanese advance through Malaya stunned British commanders for a simple, overwhelming reason. It moved faster than any calculation of motorized warfare allowed.
British planning assumed that rapid advance required heavy logistics. Tanks needed roads, trucks required fuel depots. The standard defense strategy was simple: destroy the bridges, block the roads, and the attacker would halt.
This logic was sound against any conventional army. The Japanese army, however, chose a unique solution. Thousands of infantrymen were equipped with simple, civilian-style bicycles.
These were not symbols of improvisation. They were deliberately selected, optimal tools for the environment. Roads in Malaya were frequently narrow, often unsuitable for heavy armor, yet perfect for light, silent movement. A bicycle required no imported fuel, could be carried across demolished obstacles, repaired locally with minimal effort, and pushed through mud where heavy supply trucks failed completely. This transformed the operational tempo. Japanese units could advance at speeds that shocked the defenders, often covering distances in a single day that British planners had estimated would take 3 or 4 days for marching columns. When bridges were demolished, the soldiers simply lifted their bicycles and crossed the river. When roads were effectively blocked, they rode along narrow plantation tracks or through the edges of the forest. Defensive positions prepared to delay motorized columns found themselves completely bypassed.
The real advantage was not just sheer speed, but endurance. Infantry arriving on bicycles were significantly less exhausted than troops marching comparable distances on foot, allowing for immediate engagement upon contact.
Units that withdrew, expecting hours to reorganize, were instead subjected to continuous, overwhelming pressure, never given the space to reset their defenses.
Reports from the Malayan campaign unanimously reveal a pattern of defensive collapse driven not by numerically superior force, but by relentless momentum.
British units withdrew repeatedly, not because they were defeated in tactical engagements, but because the enemy arrived before new positions could possibly be prepared.
In this context, the simple bicycle became a strategic weapon, allowing an army with limited mechanization to entirely dictate the pace of an entire theater of operations.
Speed did not come from engines. It came from an intimate understanding of terrain and a ruthless exploitation of enemy assumptions.
Japanese victories were frequently decided before the decisive firefight ever happened through the patient, coordinated application of encirclement and flanking maneuvers.
While many armies sought battlefield breakthrough by violently battering the enemy's strongest points, Japanese commanders consistently aimed elsewhere.
Their strategic priority was not the destruction of the front line, but the rendering of that line irrelevant. Encirclement and flanking operations were built on precision and patience. A necessary portion of the force fixed the enemy in place, engaging just enough to ensure the defenders held their attention forward.
Meanwhile, the maneuver elements moved wide, through dense jungle, along secondary plantation roads, or across terrain assumed to be utterly impractical. The goal was depth over speed.
Once the maneuver elements reached the enemy's rear or exposed flank, pressure was increased simultaneously across the entire front. This method exploited a critical structural weakness in many Allied formations. Defensive positions were built only to face the front.
Supply routes, field hospitals, ammunition caches, and high-value command elements were positioned behind the line, often protected by only minimal rear guard units. When Japanese troops appeared in these critical areas, the tactical picture changed instantly.
Units still possessing full ammunition stocks and numerical strength suddenly faced an unresolvable dilemma: hold their ground and risk complete isolation and strangulation, or withdraw immediately before the encirclement closed completely. In many cases, the inevitable withdrawal began before the main engagement had even escalated. The devastating collapse of Singapore perfectly illustrated this pattern. British forces were not annihilated in a single catastrophic battle. Instead, they were steadily, ruthlessly outmaneuvered. Each enforced retreat shortened Japanese supply lines while severely stretching Allied ones. Each successful flanking movement forced defenders to abandon increasingly prepared positions that had never even been directly breached by the main force. What made these encirclements so effective was meticulous timing. They often followed immediately after night assaults or infiltration actions that had already severely weakened enemy command and coordination. By the time commanders realized their flanks and rear were fatally compromised, the window for an organized, effective response had narrowed to nothing. Encirclement was not about dramatic destruction. It was about absolute control of space, movement, and the enemy's decision-making process. Once the enemy was perpetually forced to react instead of plan, the final outcome became increasingly predictable.
Japanese commanders grasped a principle that would be rediscovered time and again in modern conflict. An army does not need to be crushed to be defeated. It only needs to lose its freedom of action.
By 1943, the tide of the war had dramatically changed, and the Japanese army, faced with overwhelming Allied firepower and air superiority, changed with it. Early campaigns relied on speed, surprise, and maneuver.
But as Allied resources became inexhaustible, Japanese commanders accepted a harsh new reality. Forward defense was obsolete. Beaches could not be held. Air superiority could not be contested.
The only resource that could still be controlled was time. The solution was the adoption of defense in depth, a layered strategy of attrition. Instead of concentrating forces along the shorelines, Japanese units withdrew into layered, inland positions.
Each defensive zone was meticulously designed not to stop the enemy outright, but to fracture the advancing force into smaller components and bleed them dry over time. Firepower was rigidly conserved. Engagements were selective.
Positions were only abandoned when their maximum possible cost had been extracted from the attacker.
Tunnel systems became the operational backbone of this defense. Across islands like Saipan, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa, Japanese engineers carved extensive underground networks into the hardest volcanic rock and coral. These vast tunnel complexes connected firing positions, command bunkers, medical stations, and supply caches. They allowed units to survive continuous naval and aerial bombardments that would have annihilated surface defenses many times over. Allied forces repeatedly encountered positions they had declared neutralized, often flattened by thousands of artillery rounds, only to have those positions suddenly reopen devastating fire hours or days later. Progress became measured not in miles, but in agonizing meters. The tactical effect was profound. Every single advance required immediate, close-quarter combat. Flamethrowers, heavy demolition charges, and infantry assaults replaced the rapid maneuver of the earlier war. Casualties mounted at an alarming rate for the Allies, even when objectives were technically secured. The longer an island held, the more resources, time, and lives the Allies were forced to expend to take it. What made this system especially dangerous was the supreme discipline of the defenders. Many units were strictly ordered to remain concealed until the optimal moment, resisting the urge to fire early and preserving the element of surprise even while defending. In this phase of the war, Japanese strategy no longer sought victory through rapid movement. It sought endurance through absolute resistance, turning the natural terrain into an ally and inevitability itself into a grinding process of attrition. The battlefield no longer advanced forward, it sank downward into the earth. This grim attrition demanded equally grim tactics.
especially against the overwhelming presence of Allied armor.
By the later stages of the war, Japanese soldiers faced the battlefield reality of the Allied tank, which dominated open ground, resisted almost all standard infantry weapons, and crushed surface defenses.
For many armies, this technological gap would have spelled the end of meaningful resistance. For the Japanese army, it necessitated a shift towards something personal, visceral, and horrifying: anti-tank combat at point-blank range.
Lacking sufficient modern anti-tank guns, Japanese units developed tactics centered on extreme physical proximity. Soldiers were trained to approach tanks using every available element of cover: terrain folds, thick smoke, shell craters, and of course, darkness. Attacks were launched from the most vulnerable, blind angles: the sides, rear, or the area directly beneath the turret, where armor was thinnest and the crew's visibility severely limited. The specialized weapons reflected this necessary reality: magnetic mines, satchel charges, pole explosives, and bundled grenades, all designed for one purpose: immediate, overwhelming destruction at the point of contact. These were not standoff tools. They required the attacker to physically reach the vehicle itself. The strategic impact extended far beyond the number of destroyed tanks. Even the constant threat of these close-range, suicidal attacks forced Allied tank crews to fundamentally change their behavior. Tanks slowed down dramatically.
Infantry support tightened around the vehicles, formations compressed, and advances that could have been rapid became agonizingly cautious. This profound psychological shift altered the rhythm of entire operations.
Japanese soldiers paid a severe, unavoidable price. Casualties were tragically high, and survival rates for these specialized assault teams were extremely low. But Japanese doctrine measured success differently.
If one disabled vehicle successfully halted an entire column, delayed a crucial assault, or forced a massive rerouting under fire, the tactic had achieved its purpose. In places like Okinawa, tank crews reported perpetual, debilitating anxiety, stemming not from distant artillery, but from the terrifying, unseen figures moving silently within meters of their hulls. Armor provided protection, but it offered no certainty. These tactics revealed a harsh truth of late-war combat. Technological superiority could dominate the field, but it could not fully eliminate fear and extreme violence at close range.
Ultimately, Japanese close-range anti-tank tactics were not about stopping the advance forever. They were about making every single step forward feel earned, dangerous, and exorbitantly costly.
Steel could advance, but flesh still retained the power to slow it down. Finally, we must address the Banzai charge. Despite its enduring and often misrepresented image, the massed frontal assault was never the Imperial Japanese Army's primary or preferred way of fighting. It existed only at the extreme end of the tactical spectrum, deployed when maneuver was impossible, defenses were collapsing, and the outcome was no longer in doubt. In these final, desperate moments, the entire logic of the battlefield changed. Encirclement had failed, supplies were exhausted, ammunition was critically low, command structures were broken or rendered irrelevant.
Under such extreme conditions, Japanese commanders sometimes ordered full-scale charges, aiming not to regain lost territory, but to impose maximum unacceptable cost in the final phase of the battle. These attacks were sudden, violent, and visually overwhelming. Large numbers of soldiers surged forward simultaneously, often launched in the crucial period of twilight or pre-dawn confusion.
The objective was never survival, it was absolute disruption, to break enemy cohesion, inflict extreme casualties, and force the close combat scenario where numerical and technological superiority mattered least.
In several documented instances, these charges achieved temporary, bloody tactical success. Defensive lines were briefly breached, positions were overrun, and Allied units suffered severe, unexpected losses. However, the outcome was inevitably temporary. Without any reserves or resupply, the attacking force was quickly and catastrophically destroyed. What made the Banzai charge briefly effective was not military strategy, but sheer, overwhelming psychological shock.
defenders trained for controlled, defensive engagements suddenly found themselves facing pure chaos at point-blank range.
Fire discipline often broke down. Communication faltered. Even well-equipped units could be fundamentally shaken by the sheer, suicidal intensity of the assault. Yet, by the later stages of the war, the limitations became undeniable. Allied forces adapted, increasing their defensive firepower and improving coordination. The same attacks that had once shocked defenders now resulted in catastrophic, one-sided losses for the attackers.
The mass charge did not disappear due to ideological shift, but because it ceased to be a viable military option. In the end, it represented something stark and terrible. Not a path to victory, but a final, tragic assertion of agency when all other options were exhausted.
It was not how the Japanese army wanted to fight, but how it fought when there was nothing left to fight with. Thank you for watching this breakdown of the Imperial Japanese Army's devastating mastery of operational darkness and tactical surprise.
If this analysis changed how you perceive the Pacific theater of World War II, don't just hit like. Tell us below which specific doctrine, from the bicycle advance to the defensive tunnels, you found most strategically shocking.
And if you want to understand the terrifying mathematics behind how the U.S. Army learned to counter these infiltration tactics using specialized chemical warfare, make sure you don't miss our next deep dive.